The desert had its own kind of silence, not empty, but alive. It whispered through the sagebrush, hummed against the rocks, and breathed through the cracks of old wooden doors. On nights like this, when the wind moaned and the clouds rolled low over the sand, you could almost believe the desert was alive, and watching. Mary Dalton knew that silence better than anyone. For 3 years she'd lived alone in her late husband's cabin, on the far edge of the Arizona Territory, a place too far for company, too dry for crops, and too forgotten for law or gossip. She'd grown used to the rhythm of solitude, the creak of the porch, the hiss of the kettle, the long conversations she had only with herself and the wind. That night, the wind had teeth. The storm was moving in from the south, heavy with thunder and dust. Rain was rare in these parts, but when it came angry. The sky flickered with white veins, and the thunder rumbled deep enough to shake the floorboards. Mary set another log on the fire, pulling her shawl tight around her shoulders. The air smelled of smoke and sage, and a strange, metallic taste hung in the wind, like change. Then came the sound that didn't belong. A knock. Soft at first, then again, louder, urgent, 3 raps that cut through the roar of the storm. Mary froze. Her hand stopped halfway to the kettle. She stared at the door, her heart drumming. No one came out here. Not in the middle of the night. Not in this kind of weather. Another knock, this time a man's voice, strained and low. "Ma'am, please." The voice was faint, roughened by pain or dust or both. Mary's instinct said danger, but something in that voice, desperation, pushed against her fear. She lifted the rifle from beside the hearth, the same one her husband used to carry. Her hands trembled slightly as she walked toward the door. The firelight behind her threw a long, thin shadow across the floorboards. "Who's there?" she called out. No answer, only the wind. Then again, a thud, like a body collapsing against the door. Mary's breath caught. She hesitated only a heartbeat before unbolting the latch and pulling the door open. Lightning split the sky. A man stood there, half fallen against the frame, tall, broad-shouldered, soaked in rain and streaked with blood. His hat was gone, his dark hair plastered to his forehead. He clutched his side with one gloved hand, the other braced against the doorway to keep from collapsing completely. "Please," he whispered again, his voice barely audible. "Just a place to rest." Mary's eyes took in the torn coat, the mud-caked boots, the blood seeping between his fingers. She could see the holster at his belt, empty. A gunman, maybe, or worse, but the storm howled behind him, and the look in his eyes, tired, pleading, left no room for cruelty. "Come in," she said softly. He staggered through the doorway, nearly collapsing as the wind slammed the door shut behind him. Mary grabbed his arm, guiding him toward the hearth. His weight was heavy, but she managed to lower him onto the rug near the fire. "Thank you," he rasped, eyes fluttering shut. She could see now how pale he was, his skin ashen beneath the dirt. The blood on his side was thick and dark. "Don't thank me yet," she muttered, fetching a basin of water. "You might not live till morning." He gave a weak, crooked smile. Wouldn't be the first time someone said that. Mary knelt beside him, cutting open his torn shirt with a pair of shears. The wound was bad, a gunshot, by the look of it, torn through the ribs and half clotted. She'd seen enough in her time to know it wasn't fresh. 2 days old, maybe. Festered by travel and heat. "What happened to you?" she asked, cleaning the wound. "Wrong place, wrong men," he murmured. "You a lawman?" He shook his head faintly. "Outlaw, then." His lips twitched. "Depends who you ask." Mary didn't press further. She worked silently, washing the blood away, wrapping the wound tight with linen. The rain beat against the windows, and the fire cast the only light between them. When she was done, she leaned back, studying him. He looked younger now that the dirt was gone, maybe mid-30s. A man used to hard miles and harder choices. Scars crossed his forearm like pale lightning. His hands were calloused, his nails black with dust. There was something about him, danger, yes, but something else too. Sadness. "Name?" she asked finally. "Elias," he said. "Elias Crow." She nodded slowly. "I'm Mary Dalton." The storm outside deepened, rumbling across the horizon. For a moment neither spoke. The fire cracked, and the sound of rain against the glass filled the silence between them. "You shouldn't have opened that door," Elias murmured after a while, eyes still half closed. "Why's that?" "Sometimes trouble knocks real polite." Mary gave a dry smile. And sometimes it just needs a place to rest. He looked at her then, really looked. In the flicker of the firelight, her features softened, the lines of loss around her eyes, the quiet strength in her jaw. Not beautiful in the way of city women, but real, like weathered wood and desert flowers. Elias's eyelids grew heavy. I'll be gone by sunrise, he whispered. Mary shook her head. Not in that condition, you won't. He didn't answer. Sleep took him before she could argue. She sat there for a long time after, watching the storm rage beyond the window. In the firelight, the stranger's face looked almost peaceful, though she could see the tension in his jaw, the ghosts that followed him even into sleep. Outside, thunder rolled over the desert. Inside, two lives, a lonely widow and a wounded drifter, had just crossed paths in a way neither could have expected. And somewhere in that dark, wild night, the desert itself seemed to breathe, as if it knew what had begun. The frontier had its own rhythm, one that was harsh, unrelenting, yet quietly mesmerizing. Snow melted into rivulets that ran across the plains, carrying the scent of wet earth and the faint aroma of pine from distant ridges. The days lengthened, bringing sunlight that was at once blinding and golden, stretching across the grasslands in waves of warmth that belied the chill still lingering in the shade. For Lieutenant James Harrow, life at the outpost remained a blend of routine and vigilance, punctuated by patrols across the sprawling wilderness and the occasional clash with nature, or the occasional threat that lingered in the distance like a shadow he could neither touch nor see. He had become accustomed to the solitude, yet solitude had a weight, a kind of silence that pressed against the soul. It was during these long hours, wandering the ridge paths with only the wind as company, that he would think of Eleanor Merrick. Her letters had become a lifeline, a bridge across the vast emptiness, a soft illumination in a world often colored by gray frost and muted sunsets. The second letter he received from her arrived one morning, delivered with the usual bureaucratic delay, crumpled slightly at the corners. She wrote of the small changes at home, the bloom of early daffodils in her garden, the arrival of spring birds with feathers glistening in the sun, the small acts of kindness she had witnessed in the town square. Eleanor spoke of her nights spent reading aloud, her voice filling empty rooms, as though trying to make them resonate with life once more. Harrow read her letter aloud to himself by the fire, savoring every word. He felt as though he could almost hear her voice, tender and precise, hovering in the quiet of his hut. It was a strange comfort, this imagined presence of someone he had never met. The letters themselves became rituals. He would polish his writing desk, light the lantern, and take hours to compose his replies, each word chosen with care, each sentence a reflection of both the frontier and the delicate, living thread that connected him to her. He began to write not only about the monotony of duty but also about the subtle beauties and small dangers of life at the outpost. He described the patrols along icy ridges, the distant silhouettes of wolves that sometimes stalked the edge of their territory, the crackle of the fire at night, and the rare moments when the men would sing old songs, their voices carrying across the plains like echoes of home. In each description, Eleanor's presence was implicit, as though she were standing beside him, sharing in every sensation, feeling every chill and every fleeting warmth of the frontier. In her replies, Eleanor often mirrored this intimacy. She wrote of letters received from neighbors, of small festivals in her town, of music she had discovered, and books that had captured her imagination. She included passages from novels, poems she had loved, and stories of her own childhood memories with Thomas. Sometimes, she confessed small fears, the worry that James might be too far away, that the frontier could take him, that the letters might be all that survived should something unforeseen occur. Yet there was also courage in her words, a desire to understand, to connect, and to share her life with him, even across the distance. Weeks became months. Harrow's patrols became longer and more taxing as the seasons shifted. He would rise before dawn, donning layers of wool, leather, and fur, and trek across snow-drained plains or through marshy lowlands where the mud threatened to swallow his boots. The wind was a constant companion, cutting through him with unrelenting force, yet he endured it with a steadfastness fueled not only by duty but by the promise of Eleanor's letters. There were nights when the cold pressed through his hut walls so completely that sleep was a distant memory. He would sit by the fire, staring into the dancing flames, penning letters with meticulous care, tracing each curve of his handwriting as though the act itself could bridge the miles. He poured his thoughts into the letters, the exhilaration of discovering animal tracks in the snow, the terror during skirmishes with wandering bandits, the loneliness of watching sunsets alone, and the quiet triumph of surviving another day. In one particularly long letter, Harrow described a patrol along the northern ridge where he had encountered a herd of elk. He detailed their movements, the way the sunlight caught the dew on their antlers, the soft sound of their hooves on frozen ground. Eleanor's reply, when it came, was filled with wonder, as though she were standing beside him, marveling at the scene through his eyes. She wrote of her own moments of observation, flowers blooming too early, the gentle fall of rain, the small joys she found in a world that often seemed confining. Through these exchanges, an unspoken intimacy grew. They shared fears and hopes, silent dreams, and fragments of their souls. Harrow found that he could tell her things he could not confide in his fellow soldiers, his doubts, his memories of Thomas, the small regrets he carried in the corners of his heart. Eleanor responded with understanding and empathy, creating a space in her letters where honesty and vulnerability were safe, where emotion could flow freely without judgment. Winter faded entirely, leaving behind fertile plains and rushing rivers. Harrow's patrols extended into territories previously unexplored, and the solitude became almost sacred. He would walk for hours along ridges, imagining Eleanor reading the letters he sent, imagining her thoughts and reactions, imagining the conversation that existed silently between them through ink and paper. The frontier had become a canvas upon which they painted a shared world, a world that existed in letters, in imagination, and in the quiet, unspoken bond that grew with every correspondence. Yet the solitude of the frontier was not without peril. During a particularly long patrol, Harrow's unit encountered a sudden blizzard, the wind howling through the ridges like a living entity intent on swallowing them whole. Visibility dropped to near zero, and each man struggled to keep his footing on the icy terrain. Harrow wrote to Eleanor later, describing the storm in vivid detail, the way the snow whipped across the plains, how state. In response, Eleanor wrote back with a mixture of concern and fascination, asking questions about his survival, expressing admiration for his endurance, and sharing small personal stories to distract him from the harshness he endured. Through every trial, the letters became more than communication. They were lifelines, tangible proof of connection, proof that despite the miles, the danger, and the isolation, human hearts could reach each other. Harrow realized that his sense of duty was no longer just toward the regiment or the outpost, it was toward this unseen, unwavering presence who awaited his words across the distance. By the end of the first year of their correspondence, the bond had solidified into something undeniable. Harrow had begun to think of Eleanor as more than a recipient of letters. She had become a mirror of his own emotions, a companion in the most profound sense, a presence that existed in every patrol, every quiet evening by the fire, every glance across the frozen plains. He found himself speaking to her aloud as he wrote, sometimes laughing at small absurdities of frontier life, sometimes whispering confessions he had never dared admit. Eleanor, in turn, confided her own fears and hopes with increasing candor. She spoke of her loneliness, her longing to see the world beyond her home, and the small victories that marked her days. She began to ask questions of him not as an outsider but as someone intimately invested in his life, questions about what he feared, what he hoped for, what he had never told another soul. It was during this period that Harrow came to understand the true depth of their connection. Letters, which had begun as a channel for grief, had transformed into something far more significant, a shared existence that transcended distance, danger, and time. Through words, they had created a world together, a world in which sorrow could be spoken, joy could be shared, and intimacy could flourish even in the most barren of landscapes. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the distant mountains, casting long shadows over the plains, Harrow sat by the fire with a letter freshly opened. Eleanor's words spoke of her day, the way sunlight had caught the morning dew on her garden, the quiet pleasure of reading a book aloud, the memory of Thomas that lingered in her mind. She wrote with care, with curiosity, with a gentle humor that made him smile despite the fatigue in his bones. He read her letter aloud, feeling the wind press against the walls of his hut, imagining her presence in every line. It was in moments like these that Harrow realized the frontier had become more than a place of isolation, it was a landscape upon which their souls had begun to meet. The mountains, the rivers, the endless plains were not merely obstacles or scenery, they were the canvas upon which their connection had been painted, letter by letter, word by word, across distance, time, and silence. And so, in the quiet solitude of the frontier, Lieutenant James Harrow discovered a truth that would shape the months and years to come. Human hearts, even when separated by unimaginable distances, could find each other, could speak, could share, could grow. Through the exchange of letters, through the careful articulation of thought and feeling, he had found a companion, a confidant, and a presence that gave life meaning in a world defined by its harshness and its silence. The desert had a strange way of keeping secrets. It buried bones, swallowed trails, and let men disappear without a whisper. But it never forgot. No matter how far you rode, your past always found a way to follow, like a shadow you couldn't outrun. By the fourth morning, Elias Crow was strong enough to saddle a horse. Or at least, he tried. Mary found him out by the corral, struggling to tighten the cinch on her husband's old mare. His shirt was half-buttoned, the bandage beneath it stained dark again. The sun glinted off his hair, and for a moment, he looked like any other ranch hand, except for the weariness in his movements. "You planning to kill yourself on that horse?" she called from the porch. Elias turned, the ghost of a smile tugging at his mouth. "Just trying to stretch my legs. You'll stretch them straight into a grave if you don't rest another day." He stopped, leaning one arm against the saddle horn, his breath catching slightly. "Can't stay, Mary. You said that yesterday, and the day before," he admitted. "But this time, I mean it." She folded her arms, watching him. "Running never fixed much, Elias." "Neither does waiting," he said quietly. The wind moved between them, carrying the dry scent of mesquite. Mary looked at him, this man who'd appeared like a ghost out of the storm, and felt a strange ache stir beneath her ribs. She told herself it was only worry. But she knew better. "You won't make it far," she said finally. "Maybe not, but staying here puts you at risk. Those men I mentioned, they don't forgive easy." He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "If they find me here, they'll find you too. And I won't have that on my conscience." Mary met his gaze steadily. "You think I scare easy? I've buried a husband, Elias. The desert doesn't take me without a fight." He stared at her for a long moment, then nodded. "You've got more grit than most men I've known." She smiled faintly. "Then quit wasting it arguing with me. Go rest." He chuckled, defeated, and turned back toward the cabin. But something dark flickered in his eyes, a tension he couldn't shake. That night, the moon rose red over the mesa. Mary couldn't sleep. The wind had changed again, soft, but uneasy, like the desert was holding its breath. Elias was awake too, sitting by the fire, the old rifle across his knees. His expression was distant, listening for something only he could hear. "You expecting company?" she asked quietly. He looked up, startled. Then shook his head. "Just habit. Too many nights waiting for the wrong kind of knock." Mary crossed the room and poured 2 cups of coffee. She handed him one, their fingers brushing, a small, electric moment that made them both pause. The air between them seemed to hum. "Tell me the truth," she said after a while. "Who are these men you're running from?" Elias hesitated, then sighed. "Used to ride with them. Years back. A gang out of Prescott. Called themselves the Delaney brothers, though they weren't kin by blood. Robbers, smugglers, killers, some of them. And you." "I was their tracker. Best shot in the group. Until I saw what they were capable of." His jaw tightened. "We hit a stagecoach outside Flagstaff. Thought it was carrying payroll. Turned out it was a family, a man, his wife, 2 kids. They didn't make it." Mary's hand froze around her cup. "My God. I walked away that night," he said softly. "Took a bullet for it, too. Thought I could outrun what I'd done. Guess the desert had other plans." The silence that followed was thick as the night outside. Mary looked at him, the pain in his eyes, the honesty, and felt something she hadn't felt in years, compassion. "You can't change what's behind you," she said quietly. "But you can decide what kind of man you are when the past comes calling." Elias looked up, searching her face. "And what if the past doesn't give me that choice?" Before she could answer, a sound cut through the quiet. Hoofbeats, faint at first, but growing louder. Steady, measured. Elias's head snapped toward the window. The coffee cup hit the table with a dull thud. Mary's pulse quickened. "Riders. 2, he said. "Maybe 3. He moved to the window, peering out into the moonlit desert. Dust trails shimmered in the distance, faint but real. "They found me." Without a word, Mary crossed to the wall and took down her husband's rifle. She checked the chamber, her movements calm but sharp. Elias turned toward her, surprise flickering in his eyes. You know how to use that. She gave him a hard look. I know how to protect what's mine. For a moment, they just stared at each other, two souls bound by something larger than fear. Then Elias said quietly, they'll be here before sunrise. The hours that followed stretched long and tense. Elias checked the window every few minutes, scanning the horizon. Mary prepared what little ammunition she had and doused the lanterns. The desert outside had gone eerily still, even the coyotes were silent. Sometime past midnight, Elias spoke again. If anything happens, you take the back trail behind the shed. It cuts toward the ridge. You'll be safe there. I'm not leaving you. Mary, I mean it, she said firmly. This is my home. I've lost enough without adding guilt to the list. He looked at her, really looked, and something inside him softened. You're braver than most men I've known. Then stop treating me like I ain't one of them. He almost smiled, but the sound of hoofs shattered the quiet. They came from the ridge, two figures on horseback, dark against the silver of the moon. One carried a lantern that swung like a small, angry sun. The other dismounted, walking toward the porch with a heavy step. Elias raised his rifle slightly, eyes narrowing. Delaney, he muttered, didn't think he'd ride this far south. Mary crouched near the window, heart hammering. Through the glass, she could just make out the man's face, sharp features, a cruel mouth, eyes cold as river stone. The kind of man who'd kill for the pleasure of it. Crow, the man shouted, his voice carrying over the desert. You in there? Elias didn't answer. The man laughed. You always did have a taste for lost causes. Come on out, and maybe I'll let the lady keep her skin. Mary's stomach turned cold. Elias's jaw tightened, fury burning beneath his calm. Stay inside, he whispered. No matter what you hear. Before she could argue, he stepped out the door, rifle in hand. The wind caught his coat, the moonlight catching on the barrel. Delaney grinned from the foot of the porch. Well, I'll be damned. Thought you'd bled out days ago. Disappointed? Elias asked. Not yet, but I aim to be satisfied. Two other riders emerged from the shadows, rifles gleaming. Mary held her breath behind the curtain, her finger hovering near the trigger of her own gun. Delaney took a slow step forward. You should have stayed dead, Crow. Would have saved us the ride. I tried, Elias said. Didn't take. Then, silence. The desert itself seemed to listen. When the first shot cracked, it sounded like thunder rolling across the sand. Mary fired before she could think, a burst of instinct and fear. The lantern shattered, plunging the scene into near darkness. Men shouted, hoofs screamed, and gunfire split the air. Sparks flew as bullets struck the porch rail. Elias dove behind the post, returning fire with quick, precise shots. One of Delaney's men dropped from his saddle. The other retreated behind a rock outcrop, yelling curses into the wind. Delaney himself ducked low, reloading. You think she can save you, Crow? He shouted. You'll bring her down with you. Elias's answer was another gunshot, close enough to clip the man's hat clean off. Then, as suddenly as it began, silence fell again. Only the wind moved, whispering through the brush. Mary crept to the door, heart still pounding. Elias, I'm here, he said, voice low. He's gone. For now. She stepped out, the air sharp and cold against her skin. Elias stood in the moonlight, his chest rising hard, smoke curling from his rifle. The body of one rider lay still near the fence. The others had fled, leaving tracks carved deep in the wet sand. Mary looked at him, at the blood on his sleeve, the wildness in his eyes, and something inside her broke open. Fear, relief, and something deeper tangled together until she couldn't tell them apart. You saved my life, she said softly. He shook his head. No, Mary, you saved mine, more than once. The night stretched long after that. They buried the dead man at dawn, beneath a lone mesquite tree at the edge of the property. Neither spoke much. Words felt small against the weight of what had happened. When it was done, Elias stood staring out at the desert, the same desert he'd been running through for years. This place, he said quietly. It's got a way of testing a man. Showing him who he really is. Mary glanced at him. And who are you, Elias Crow? He turned to her, the first light of morning catching his face. A man who's finally tired of running. She didn't answer, but the way she looked at him, steady, unflinching, said enough. The desert wind moved between them, carrying the scent of sunrise and dust. Something new had begun. Something neither of them could stop, nor quite name. The desert was silent that night, but not peaceful. The silence carried tension, the kind that hums in the air before a storm or a confession. Clara sat on the porch, her shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders. The stars shimmered above like scattered shards of glass. From the barn, she could hear Elias moving, slow, deliberate, as if trying not to disturb the night itself. It had been a week since that night by the fire when their eyes had met too long, their words had gone too deep. Since then, something had shifted between them. The air in the house had changed. It wasn't just kindness anymore, it was yearning. A quiet understanding. Each morning, Clara would find Elias already outside, feeding the horses, fixing the fences, doing work that used to take her all day. His shoulder still ached, but he never complained. She brought him water and biscuits, and he'd thank her softly, his voice deep, gentle, careful. Sometimes they didn't speak for hours, yet it felt like they did. The silence between them was no longer empty. It was alive, filled with something neither dared to name. One evening, when the heat finally faded, Clara walked out to the barn to find Elias cleaning his old revolver. It was worn and dull, like it had seen too many battles. "You still carry that?" she asked quietly. Elias looked up, his eyes shadowed by the lantern's glow. "Habit," he said. "And maybe, fear." "Fear of what?" He paused, then said in a low voice, "That the past might ride up behind me one day." Clara didn't push. She could see the weight he carried, the kind only a man who's seen too much could bear. When she turned to leave, he said softly, "You shouldn't have to live out here alone, Clara." She froze. No one had spoken her name like that in years, gently, like it meant something. "I'm not alone anymore," she replied, her voice barely a whisper. The storm inside. That night, sleep refused to come. Clara lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. She could hear the faint creak of the barn door, the shuffle of Elias's boots. Every sound of him felt close, almost too close. Memories of her late husband drifted through her mind, how he had been kind at first, then distant, then gone, lost to the desert's cruel sun. She remembered the loneliness that had followed, the long nights of silence, the fear that she'd become invisible to the world. And now, here was this stranger, this wounded man, breathing life back into her days. When the wind picked up, rattling the windows, Clara got up and lit a candle. She hesitated at the door before walking toward the barn. The night air was cool, the kind that carried the scent of sage and sand. Elias looked up when she entered, surprise flickering in his eyes. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked. "Could you?" she countered softly. He smiled faintly. "Not much." The silence that followed was tender, trembling. Clara's heart beat so loud she thought he could hear it. "Elias," she whispered, "what are you running from?" He sighed, staring at the floor. "A mistake. Maybe two. Maybe too many." She stepped closer. "You don't have to tell me everything. Just, don't lie to me." His eyes met hers then, blue-gray like a storm about to break. "I've never lied to you, Clara. Not once." Confession in candlelight. The barn was dim, the air thick with dust and the smell of hay. The candlelight trembled between them. Elias leaned forward, resting his hands on his knees. "There was a man," he began slowly. "A sheriff. He said I was guilty of something I didn't do. When I tried to prove my innocence, things went bad. There was a fight. A gun went off." Clara's breath caught. "You killed him." "I don't know," Elias said, his voice breaking slightly. "I didn't mean to. I was just trying to survive. But after that, there was no going back. They put a price on my head." She took a step closer. "So you're a fugitive." He looked up at her, eyes glistening. "I'm a man who made mistakes. Who's tired of running." Clara stood still for a long moment. Then she whispered, "I don't care who you were, Elias. I care who you are now." Her words hit him harder than a bullet. He reached for her hand, slow, uncertain. When his fingers brushed hers, it felt like touching sunlight after years in shadow. The kiss. The world seemed to hold its breath. The candle flickered. Outside, the coyotes howled somewhere in the dark. Clara didn't move away. She could feel his breath, warm and close. Elias searched her eyes as if asking permission without words. And then, they kissed. It wasn't the wild kiss of youth, but something deeper. The kind that comes from two broken souls finding something whole. When they parted, she stayed close, her forehead resting against his. "This is wrong," she whispered, but her voice had no conviction. "Maybe," he murmured, "but it feels like the only right thing I've known in years." Dash dash dash. Footsteps in the distance. Days passed. They worked side by side, spoke in glances more than words. But peace in the desert never lasted long. One afternoon, as Elias repaired the corral fence, a cloud of dust rose on the horizon. Clara squinted. 2 riders were approaching fast. Her heart dropped. "Elias," she called, her voice sharp with fear. He looked up, saw the figures, and went pale. "They found me," he said quietly. Clara's breath hitched. "What do we do?" He stepped forward, calm but resolute. "You stay inside. Lock the door. No matter what happens. I'm not leaving you," she said fiercely. Elias turned, his hand brushing her cheek. "You already saved me once. Don't let it cost you everything." She wanted to argue, but the look in his eyes stopped her. It wasn't fear, it was acceptance. Dash dash dash. The return of the past. The riders drew near, one wearing a sheriff's badge that caught the sunlight like fire. "Elias Monroe," the sheriff shouted. "By the authority of the Arizona Territory, you're under arrest." Elias stood tall, unarmed. "You don't want to do this, Sheriff." "Not here." Clara watched from the window, her hands trembling. The sheriff dismounted, boots crunching on dry earth. "You can come quiet, or we can end this right now." Elias's voice was steady. "You still think I killed your deputy, don't you?" "I don't think. I know," the sheriff snarled. Before Elias could reply, the other man raised his gun. Clara screamed. A shot rang out. The world spun into chaos. Dash dash dash. When the dust settled, Elias was still standing, but barely. The sheriff lay on the ground, clutching his leg, his gun kicked away. Elias's shoulder bled again, the old wound torn open. He stumbled back toward the porch where Clara ran to meet him. "Elias," she cried, catching him as he fell to his knees. He looked up at her, pain in his eyes but a faint smile on his lips. "Guess I wasn't done running after all," he said weakly. Tears streamed down her cheeks. "You're not dying on me, Elias. Not now, not like this." He brushed her face with trembling fingers. "You make me wish I'd lived differently." Dash dash dash. Under the moonlight, that night, Clara sat by his side again, pressing cloth to his wound. The moonlight poured through the window, soft and silver. Elias spoke between shallow breaths. "If they take me, promise you'll forget me." She shook her head. "I can't. You have to." "No," she said, her voice fierce and shaking. "Because you didn't just knock on my door that night. You knocked on my heart. And I let you in." He smiled faintly, eyes glistening. "Then maybe that's enough." Dash dash dash. Outside, the desert wind carried the echoes of what had been, 2 souls who had found each other at the edge of the world, bound by fate, torn by consequence. And as dawn crept over the horizon, Clara whispered a silent prayer. That somehow, somewhere, love might still be stronger than the past. The early morning sun stretched across the horizon like molten gold, painting the distant ridges in hues of amber and rose. A gentle breeze carried the scent of damp earth, mingled with wildflowers that had burst forth in the warmth of late summer. The frontier, vast and indifferent, seemed to hold its breath in anticipation of what was to come. Lieutenant James Harrow stood at the edge of the ridge, eyes fixed on the approaching convoy. Each hoofbeat of the horses, each creak of the wagon wheels, resonated like a drumbeat in his chest. The months of letters, of shared fears and imagined presences, of loneliness and longing, had all led to this moment. He could scarcely believe that Eleanor Merrick, whose words had accompanied him through the harshest storms, the most grueling patrols, and the quietest nights, would soon step into the same space, breathing the same air. He remembered their earliest correspondence, the timid words written with care, the tentative steps of trust and connection. How strange and wonderful it was that someone so distant could occupy the center of his thoughts with such immediacy, such permanence. And yet here she was, or would soon be, and the reality of her presence, so long imagined, now threatened to overwhelm him with anticipation. The convoy emerged from a bend in the ridge, dust curling around the wheels and hooves. Harrow's breath caught. Among the travelers, moving cautiously and with the assistance of guides, was Eleanor. She looked different than he had imagined, older and younger at once, with a presence that radiated both fragility and strength. The sunlight caught her hair, a cascade of soft light, and he felt a jolt of recognition not just in the features he had envisioned but in the energy she carried. Their eyes met before words could be spoken. In that brief, electric moment, time seemed to falter. The months of letters, the shared stories, the confidences, and the unspoken longings were distilled into a single, unguarded gaze. Harrow's heart pounded, not from the exertion of the frontier or the threat of danger, but from the profound reality of connection, the tangible, physical embodiment of a bond that had been nurtured across countless miles and countless pages. Eleanor hesitated for a heartbeat, then stepped forward. Each movement was deliberate, measured, yet full of the quiet urgency that mirrored his own. The air between them seemed charged, every breath a testament to the journey that had led them here. At last, James extended a hand, and she took it, not as a formal gesture, but as a bridge across all the distance that had separated them. They walked together along the ridge, talking softly at first, voices tentative, as though testing the reality of the moment. Their conversation, once carried entirely on paper, now flowed aloud, interwoven with laughter, astonishment, and wonder. Every description in their letters became tangible. The sight of the plains stretching endlessly before them, the scent of wildflowers mingling with the crisp mountain air, the subtle rustle of leaves in the breeze. Each element of the frontier, once abstract, now served as a backdrop for the first chapter of their shared presence. Harrow led her to a small grove of trees near the edge of the ridge, a place he had long admired but never mentioned in his letters. The sunlight filtered through the leaves, casting dappled patterns on the ground, and for a moment the world seemed to pause. Here, removed from patrols, from danger, from all that had defined their lives apart, they could simply exist together, present and aware. Eleanor spoke of her fears, the anxiety of the journey, the uncertainty of leaving home, the unknown dangers of the frontier. Harrow, in turn, confessed his own, the weight of responsibility, the loneliness of the outpost, the constant shadow of danger that had been his life for so long. And yet, in sharing these fears aloud, they found a profound relief. The letters had prepared them for honesty, for intimacy, and for the realization that vulnerability could be met with understanding rather than judgment. As the day unfolded, they explored the surrounding landscape together. Harrow showed her the ridges he had traversed, the river bends he had described in letters, the hidden glades where wildlife found refuge. Eleanor, in turn, shared stories from her own world, stories she had only hinted at in letters, now given voice and weight by her presence. They laughed, pointed out distant landmarks, and marveled at the beauty that the frontier revealed in its untamed form. By evening, they returned to the outpost, welcomed by the officers and men who had grown accustomed to Harrow's routines. Eleanor's presence was met with curiosity and cautious admiration, yet she cared little for their attention. Her focus was entirely on the man whose letters had been a lifeline, whose words had bridged solitude and fear, whose presence now anchored her in a reality that had long been imagined. Night fell, blanketing the plains in darkness, punctuated only by the stars that had inspired so many of their letters. They sat together by the fire, the flickering flames casting warm light across their faces. Words became unnecessary for a time, the shared silence spoke volumes. Every glance, every smile, every brush of hands conveyed the emotions that had long been nurtured in ink and paper. Finally, as the fire dwindled to embers, Harrow spoke softly, the weight of months evident in his voice. "Eleanor," he said, I never imagined that this," he gestured broadly at the frontier, "the night, the space between them, could feel so real. Having you here, it changes everything." Eleanor reached for his hand, her own trembling slightly. "I know," she whispered. "I've lived in your letters for so long, in your words and stories, that I feared meeting you might break the illusion. But being here, it's more than I ever hoped. It's real, and it's ours." The frontier, vast and indifferent, had tested them, shaped them, and kept them apart. Yet in the meeting, in the convergence of words and presence, they discovered that the distance had not weakened their bond, it had strengthened it. The letters, the longing, the anticipation, and the shared solitude had created a foundation upon which they could now build a tangible connection. In the days that followed, Eleanor and Harrow explored the frontier together, moving cautiously but with joy, their conversations a blend of curiosity, reflection, and delight. They laughed at small absurdities, marveled at the wildlife, and found solace in the knowledge that the bond nurtured through letters had now blossomed into something real, enduring, and unshakable. When the time came for Eleanor to return to her town, the farewell was tender, but there was no anxiety, no uncertainty. They had crossed the threshold from imagination into reality, and the promise of continued letters, continued visits, and shared dreams carried the same weight it always had, except now, it was grounded in knowledge that distance could no longer diminish the connection they had forged. As Eleanor rode away with the convoy, Harrow watched her, a profound gratitude filling him. The frontier remained as vast and untamed as ever, yet it had been transformed by their presence, by the convergence of two souls long separated by circumstance but united by courage, hope, and the simple, enduring power of words. That night, beneath the infinite expanse of stars, Harrow wrote the final letter he would send before her return, a letter not of longing or anticipation, but of affirmation and quiet joy. He spoke of the meeting, of the bond they shared, and of the unshakable truth that, however vast the frontier, they had found each other. And in the quiet of the night, with the embers of the fire glowing softly, he knew that the story they had written together, line by line, word by word, letter by letter, was only beginning. The frontier, harsh and indifferent, had yielded not only survival but love, a love forged in distance, refined in solitude, and made eternal in presence. And so, as dawn approached, painting the horizon in gentle hues of pink and gold, James Harrow and Eleanor Merrick stood at the edge of the plains, hands intertwined, hearts aligned, ready to face whatever the vast world might hold, together.